What's up everybody, Matt Maran here for another car review. This is of course the 2006 BMW M5. Huge thanks to Ron at Sport Dimensions for providing me with his pristine M5 here to review for you guys today. So about the 2006 M5. So this was, the new E60 generation with its mighty V10 engine, which is something you will never see again. So this is really a gem and another high watermark in the BMW M division, I think. And so it's just a very cool look. This one, of course, very sleek here in black, and it's even sleeker, gives you a few tiny little tweaks. So you can see the front grille has the chrome deleted out of it, and so it's just a nice matte black finish there. And I know, when these first came out, this new style of 5 Series, people weren't in love with it, but I think over the years it actually has aged pretty well, and I think it is very distinctive and cool looking. This one also looks a little more mean because we have the Dynon front and rear springs that lower it a little bit. It looks really good. You even have like these carbon fiber fender vents here that look great, and so BMW was getting a little more aggressive with the styling over what you got on the E39 M5, but it still was a little bit under the radar, not super aggressive like these days. You have huge front lips and stuff. None of that going on here, but really nicely proportioned to this vehicle. I really love the shape of it. And then going out towards the back, you have the signature quad exhaust there in the back that look great, and a tiny little bit of a lip spoiler there. And so everything from the E39 they kind of made a little bit better. So you had 2 more cylinders to the engine, you had slightly wider wheels and tires that were 1 inch bigger. It went from 18s in the old one to 19s here on the new one. So everything kind of grew and got a little bit more impressive in every single metric really. And overall I think it still is a very good looking car to this day. It's the interior of the 2006 M5. So it's a very nice place to be, in an old school sense. So these days the tech's a little dated and stuff. But first thing here are the seats in the M5, which are really great. It's a really good amount of bolstering here, both for the torso and for the thighs. And it even has adjustable bolstering, which was a first for the M5 here, so that they'll get as tight as you want and really can hug you in snugly. Now it only works for the torso here, the thighs don't move, but still really great. Love these seats. You also have, of course, adjustable lumbar and all kinds of other adjustments, thigh extensions and all that. That's just a very comfortable seat and very well done job there. Next is the steering wheel in the M5, which is really cool. This is when BMW was starting into the thicker wheels, but it still is manageable, even though it is pretty thick wheel. Still has a great 9-3 grip, nice little 10-2 notches, just a couple of buttons here on it, including an M button for the first time, which was how you could program in all your individual settings if you wanted and just have that all tuned into your M mode there, which is great. And then you have these paddle shifters on the back, which by modern standards feel really cheap, but back then, not really anyone was using metal paddles, so these are plastic, look like metal, but they're good and thick and are nice to use. Next are the gauges here in the M5, which are also still pretty simple, obviously because this vehicle is still, at this point 13, 14 years old, and so you have just the 2 large analog dials. I love the speedometer that goes up to 200, which is a lot of fun. Also, having the very high red line of these engines means you have a very wide tack range there, which is also very cool to look at. And you also have an active red line there, so those yellow notches will go up if the engine's cold, and then they lower as it goes down. Not quite as cool as the illuminated ones you got on the E39 M5 in my opinion, but still cool nonetheless. And then you have a very basic trip computer here that will basically just show you your fuel economy, and that's about it in there. But you also do have a diagnostics thing you can go into and mess with some other things there in that center cluster. Coming over to the center of the dashboard here, though, you have this pretty wide and large display. BMW really set the bar high back in 2006. This is one of the biggest screens in its segment at the time, I think, and so it's a really cool widescreen display. Now it is dated with the menus and it doesn't do a whole lot like you see in the feature-packed iDrive systems these days. It is a little slow to respond at times, but honestly it's still fairly quick, and it's nice. This one has an auxiliary port there in where the cigarette ashtray would be, and so that's nice. And I believe that in later years that was something that BMW put in, and you have the auxiliary function there, and so good to have that. That helps keep it modern so that you can just still plug in a phone or some other source instead of just being forced to have only radio and CD. And so that's good to have. The maps and stuff are still, you're not going to want to use it, especially these days. Just use your phone and you're done, much easier. But climate, all that kind of stuff is fairly well laid out. Thankfully you still do have physical knobs here for setting the climate if you want, and so great to have those. And then just a little volume knob and a tune rocker by your drives there for the CD, and DVD is for navigation there. And so very few buttons. This was back in the day when BMW didn't have a million buttons. buttons, and I really like the simplicity of this. It really is great. You do have a couple other fun buttons here down by the SMG shifter. So you have the shift speed selector, you have traction control, stability control, and then the power button, which I'll be talking about more as we hit the road. But overall, as far as the luxury of this interior, I think it is, still held up pretty well to this day. You have a little bit of padding down by your knees. Everything is pretty soft touch. The center armrest is pretty soft. As far as storage space goes, it still isn't great. That's where it shows its age a little bit too, because like I said, you have the cigarette lighter and ashtray, which you never see really these days in cars. You have that, and then the doors, you have a pretty large pocket, so that's good. But as far as cup holders go, you still had, it was kind of like an afterthought, I think, with these little pop-out things here, kind of like a Porsche. And so you have one here for the driver and then one over there for the passenger. And they're sturdier and thicker than what you get in like a 911 or something. So better than Porsche, but still not as good as a normal cup holder like you saw in later generations just here in the center. But then you do have the center armrest, which does open up for the first time in an M5 here. The E39s did not. And then you have this little area here, which some had a car phone or something, but this one just has a little tray there. And then you open it up again, and you have another little tray down there. And those are, pretty usable spaces, not large enough for a modern smartphone or anything, but a good amount of space to fit some knickknacks in there. Moving on to the back seat though, in the M5 here, it's pretty good. So it's a little bit roomier than what you got in the E39. So I'm 5'9", me sitting behind myself. I have a solid 4 inches or so of legroom to spare. A good amount of headroom as well, since this is a little bit of a taller vehicle than the E39. And then you look forward, you'll see air vents there, as well as this one has heated rear seats as an option, and also 2 power outlets, which is nice to have. And then you have a fold down center armrest, and for the first time it has a little cubby and 2 cup holders built into it, which is a nice inclusion there, and also some small little pockets in the doors, including an ashtray still, which is kind of funny how many ashtrays cars had even up until 10 or 13 years ago here. And so overall, a really good back seat. Trunk space is also very good here in the M5. It's a nice wide, long, pretty deep space, totally in line with all the competition of its day. Alright, so setting off in the 2006 BMW M5. So we're just starting off here now. This has the 7-speed SMG transmission, which is probably one of the first things you'll notice if you ever drive one of these. So it's an automated manual, so it's an actual clutch that it's moving on its own, and so because of that, it acts like a normal manual where it will roll back. You feel a clutch engaging. Again, this was the early days of these dual clutch systems before you had the more advanced and smoother operations like you have these days. And so that is one thing you'll notice, is that it has a pretty good logic whenever you're in normal drive, and it will shift itself automatically. Obviously there's no clutch pedal or anything to worry about, but it it's definitely an interesting thing. So you have this shift speed thing, and you can turn that up or down to have the shift speed smoother and slower, or faster and sharper, depending on what your mood is. And so that's nice to have. Other things to note here about the M5, you have pretty good visibility. The hood still drops down very nicely. A-pillars are a little thicker than they were in the E39s, but still great there. And a very easy car to drive, still very good view out of the back and all that kind of stuff. And so very accessible from that standpoint. Other things you'll note is you have a pretty responsive throttle, although in typical BMW fashion, at least for this kind of generation of vehicles, there's a good tip-in point before you start getting some response, unless you're in the sport modes. Also, it's kind of funny, the brake pedal is so small. It looked like they just had a manual transmission pedal set up and then just deleted the clutch pedal. So instead of having a wider brake pedal like you usually get, you have this skinny one to really convince people this was a good replacement for the manual. So you have a manual sized brake pedal there, which is kind of a cool little touch. But otherwise, it's a really, nice and relaxing vehicle to drive still, aside from, again, just that engagement point when you're starting from a stop and things like that. But I went ahead and put it into the manual mode here. We're going to put on the power button, which gives us 500 horsepower instead of 400 from this V10. And let's turn down onto this back road and see how it does. Here we go. Listen to that. Up and goes well. Oh man, yeah. Oh, this thing is fantastic. And then these brakes, ooh, they're meaty. They haul you down fast. So anyway, yeah, a 5-liter V10 engine here and the E60 M5s. 500 horsepower, 400 if you want to turn off the power button, get better fuel economy and have it be a little more sedate. And then it does 384 pound-feet of torque. So not a very torquey engine. It likes to rev out. You need to rev it out to that red line of 8,250 RPMs, which is the same as the Shelby GT350, which everyone drools over these days. This was doing it, 10 years sooner, and oh, it's a sweet engine. It is just so wonderful to have a V10 under the hood of a sedan like this. It's awesome. But yeah, the brakes, I mean, you have a little bit of a dead travel so that it's easy to be smooth with them still, but man, they clamp down hard. And you have plenty of grip too here. So, they bumped up the tire size here for the E60 M5. So you have 255s in the front and then 285s in the rear. They're Pirellis, I believe, here on this, and no issues with traction whatsoever. But listen to that. Oh man, it gives me chills almost. It's just such an amazing sound and something you're never going to find in a car in modern times here. I mean, BMW wasn't the only one to do a V10. Audi also had the Lamborghini V10 in the S6 and the S8s at the time. So that was, the other one that did that, but it still was just amazing. And BMW had the guts to put a V10 engine in this. It's just crazy. Now, one thing, this SMG transmission here, it is a little slow, but I only have it in the middle mode for the transmission shift speed. So we'll go ahead and bump that up to the faster speeds here, see how that does. So there still is a little bit of a delay there. It's almost like what you see from modern torque converter automatics. And there's a little bit of a delay there, especially if you don't let off the gas. But we just went around a few corners there. And this thing, it's so easy to go quicker than you want to go in this thing because it just wants to fly. But it handles very well too. So, it's very tight. Now this one is in pristine shape. This has less than 15,000 miles on it. So, I mean, really a pristine example, and gives you a good feel for how these were, new. Very tight, very responsive. The steering is pretty good too. You have a good amount of feel through it and a nice weight to it as well. And so that all feels great. But it's just, you definitely feel the weight a little bit more because these did gain about 200 pounds over, the previous E39. So these weigh about 4,050 pounds now, but it's still not bad by modern standards, with the new M5 being, way heavier than that. So, it's really still just feels fairly light and tossable around corners, considering you have a V10 engine under the hood in the front there, weighing over that, front axle there. It's nice and low in the engine bay, but still, it's just an amazing thing. I love the way this thing sounds. And it's such a smooth powertrain. Now, you don't have a lot of low-end grunt, but that's a sacrifice you make to have that high red line. Stuff like the Shelby has the same trade-off. That's kind of what you get with high revving engines, is you don't get a lot of stuff down low. But that's okay, because it's again, it goes back to being an enthusiast vehicle and not having just boatloads of torque down low like you're in a diesel truck or something. This, you really got to wring it out, and I love that about it. And so it just means that it forces you almost to drive it hard in a way if you really want to get up and move. And now, obviously, plenty of power. These were do 0 to 60 in 4.7 seconds, so not mind-blowing power. And honestly, that's about the same as the old E39 M5, which is 100 less horsepower. So you would think it'd be a little bit quicker than that, and maybe some magazines might have gotten a quicker 0 to 60 time than that. That's just the number that I saw. But that sounds about right. But it's just a very different experience, because that V8 and the E39s had a really meaty low end, but also it was pretty high revving, 7,000 RPM redline in those, and pretty torquey. Now this is also a 7-speed SMG, so you have one more gear to play with than what you had in the E39s, of course, with the 6-speed manual. Trying out some manual downshifts here. And it still is a little laggy. Again, for a first effort, it was good, but by modern standards, you're going to be disappointed compared to the new M5s and stuff. But we'll try. Yeah, it flies. These brakes, I think the braking force is actually more impressive than the power delivery, because these brakes really haul you down fast. That is one thing that they didn't mess around. Not that the E39s had bad brakes, but this is on a whole another level of stopping power. But even, we're on a rougher road now with, this like gravel, tar and chip kind of thing that isn't loose gravel or anything, but, a little bit of a rougher road. And it still soaks it up so well, even though we got 19-inch wheels and pretty low-profile tires. I mean, you feel some of those grooves and stuff, and they come through a little bit, but you mostly just feel it through the steering wheel, not through the seat. So it really soaks up everything nicely and makes for a great daily driver. But it's just great to know that you have such performance at your fingertips. All it takes is a couple quick little downshifts, and then you're ready to play again. Oh, that's great. It does sound very good stock. So, I do love the Eisenman race exhaust you can get for the M5 and the M6. That sounds even more glorious, and I think that's a worthwhile upgrade in my eyes, because this V10 sounds so good, but I just want to let it sing even more. And so I think that'd be a good improvement. But from a collector standpoint, obviously this one is so low miles. Messing with it is probably a little less desirable, but it drives so nicely. I will say I wish that there was a little more heft to the steering, so it's not as heavy as I would like, honestly, but it still does a good job of communicating with you, because it still is thankfully a hydraulic steering rack and everything. But, I kind of wish that was maybe a little bit tighter if I'm nitpicking, but I really don't mind. I think I prefer the steering of the E39 slightly over this, but this still is really good. Every time I lean into that gas, it just puts a smile on my face. It's just a special car to drive, but again, it still gives you a very normal, 5 Series type feeling, if that's all you want to. And I mean, the great thing, this whole generation of 5 Series was really great in so many ways. You could still get a V8 if you wanted in the 540s, but then they also introduced the 535s with the twin turbo 6-cylinder, and those really flew too, and were very impressive in their own right. And so many great flavors of the 5 Series in the E60 generation here, and this was before they really felt too big either. This feels a little lighter and simpler than whenever they got a lot heftier, I think, in the next generation going forward. But yeah, and of course now, this one does have the SMG, and for the launch year here in 2006, you could only get SMG, and at the time that this came out, they were saying, oh, it's only going to be SMG, but then the next year they did offer a manual. So if you're not a fan of this SMG, you can get the manual. That'll probably be a little more expensive because those are more desirable, I think, but you can have that if you'd like, and then that, gets rid of the transmission lag and that delay, and then you just have this glorious engine with a manual, which is even better. So I have been playing around with this SMG a little more and trying to do manual type shift. So if I go accelerate, let off the gas, shift, then I don't get the lurching of the SMG, in between shifts. So if you want to really smooth out your shifts, but you still want to go fast, that's what you do, is you kind of just treat it like a manual. So that takes a little practice, but now that I'm doing that, then it really feels like a manual. It's just being shifted without you having to use a clutch pedal. So, either way is fun. I actually kind of like the jerkiness of just keeping your foot on the gas too, but either way is very cool. Another thing worth mentioning about this engine is that it's working at a disadvantage right now, because we are just south of Denver and even higher up than Denver. So we're about a 15% less power than you usually would have at sea level. And so, that's really just puts these naturally aspirated engines at a disadvantage. If you had a turbo setup, they thrive in these kind of climates. But for these naturally aspirated things, it kind of struggles a little bit. So that's why it might not be as mind-blowing fast as you might expect for 500 horsepower from a V10. But, it still is very strong, even if it does have 15% less power than normal. It is just, I can just listen to that engine note all day. Oh man, it is just glorious. Man, this makes me all melancholy for even just, again, 13 years ago, we really had it good with all these amazing vehicles. And the great thing with these is, they're kind of, I think, bottoming out with their depreciation curve. And I think this is definitely something that's going to be a collectible someday, just because they're just so special. And like I said, never again will you see a V10 under the hood of a BMW sedan. You know, so I mean, we're even the V8s these days are an endangered species in many brands, and so, you know, this is really a special engine. It just makes for a really special driving experience. You know, this high of a red line, this kind of sound, it is really, really awesome. Yeah, I mean, I honestly, like I said, I wish the steering was a little bit tighter, but that's the only thing I can really complain about. And I think, you know, you can go into the modes and kind of mess with things a little bit. Over the years of this generation, I believe they did kind of add in some stuff and advance things a little bit more. But, oh, it just is so glorious. And again, it's such comfort, too. I think there was actually, at one point, an adaptive bolstering setup you can get, too. So it would actually squeeze you as you're going around corners to hold you in place. So you just have the most comfortable and still super supportive seat while you're doing all of this. This one doesn't have a heads-up display, but you could even get that, I believe, back then, if my memory serves me right. Because I worked at a BMW dealership back when these were new, and they were very sweet, and were the it car if you wanted a super sedan. And again, still just as special today, even though it's been, you know, 10 years since I've driven one. And that's about it. I mean, the only other thing I can say is, you know, this one is nice low mileage, so you don't have any worries with this engine. But, you know, some of the higher ones, I think this engine was a little more high strung, a little more high maintenance than your average V8 and stuff, understandably so. The SMG, I believe, you know, could have some heating issues, and obviously, like I said, it's far from seamless or flawless. It definitely, you know, was again a good first try, and that's about the most you can say about it. So those types of things, you know, kind of mar the experience a little bit. But again, if you do a manual one and, you know, you have an exhaust on here, it is just pure bliss. And even as it is this way, it is so much fun and so enjoyable. But we're coming up to some walls here, so we can kind of let this exhaust echo and just get this glorious sound. Oh man, it's impressive. And then, like I said, these brakes are so impressive too. These things are just so awesome. I'm sorry, there's really nothing else to say. It is just a blast to drive. Definitely worth driving one someday. Definitely worth, I think, owning one too, as long as you're willing to deal with, you know, the older German temperamental antics that sometimes come along with these vehicles. Like this one has the service engine soon light on, because this one isn't obviously driven very often, and so it has some, you know, emissions related thing with that. And so there are some quirks to them and stuff to deal with. But if you're willing to put up with that stuff, there's very few other sedans that are as special as this is. Now, there's lots of very impressive stuff that will tear your face off with acceleration and amazing handling and stuff. This, you know, doesn't have any of that stuff beat these days, but it still is just such a special experience. If you enjoy driving, you enjoy the sounds and the high RPMs and all that kind of stuff, then this is really one of the best out there in that regard. So anyway, huge thanks to Ron for allowing me to review his very awesome M5 here for you guys today. Let me know your thoughts on the E60 M5 in the comments below. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Take care.